Another episode of the Palmetto Politics page. Today, I'm Shannon Grady, and my partner over there,
John Cummings, good morning.
we are super excited to have a fantastic guest on. We typically don't do a lot with national news, and this gentleman is certainly a national newsmaker in that he is fighting not just for his own son, but really for the thousands of children across the United States who are being subjected to whether it be chemical castration, whether it be surgeries that are being performed on them at the tender ages of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it may be, to change their gender, their sex from male to female, female to male. And folks, I mean, that is a crucial issue, and it is something that is relevant here to South Carolina, because if you've been paying attention, you'll note that our Freedom Caucus members actually fought to stop that very thing from taking place here at MUSC, that is the Medical University of South Carolina, where they were practicing chemical castration. And so don't think this can't happen here in South Carolina, because folks, the truth of the matter is we are not a deep red state like you would suspect. If you look at our CPAC ranking, we are ranked 42nd. I mean, we have a 42% conservative voting record as a state. That makes us deep purple, leaning blue. Texas, where Mr. Jeff Younger is from, is 61% conservative. So they are they're red. They're not as deep red as we would have liked, but I think that's due in large part to a significant number of Californians moving into areas like Austin. But at the end of the day, if this kind of thing can take place in a red state like Texas, we better pay very close attention. So I want to bring on our guest today, Mr. Jeff Younger. Some of you may have seen him on Tucker Carlson show and many other Fox News programs. So we are very honored to have him. Welcome.
Howdy. Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
Yeah. So, Mr. Younger, I just want to extend to you thank you for coming on to talk to us about this critical issue, especially given that it is such a personal issue for you. And kind of update us, where is your fight right now with your son?
Well, so I got a very liberal judge in Dallas County. Dallas County is as liberal as Austin. And those cities are as liberal as San Francisco, and they have all the problems that San Francisco has. This judge systematically stripped me of my parental rights using temporary orders. And the reason she did that is in Texas, temporary orders in family court can't be appealed.
Wow.
So I have no recourse. Eventually, she gave my ex-wife permission to move my son to California. Now, my ex-wife has been trying to transition my son to a girl since he was 2 years old. He's 10 years old now. The judge gave her permission to move him to California. So I went to the Supreme Court of Texas and said, look, California passed a transgender sanctuary bill. And that bill says that California will not return my son to me under court order because he's transgender. I can never have him brought back to Texas. They will not obey subpoenas. They don't have to show up and be deposed under those subpoenas. So I can't get any evidence into a Texas court about my son. So this effectively removed all the protections of Texas law for my son. And it seemed pretty obvious to me that that was a violation of the Texas Constitution and the statutes of the state of Texas, which say that courts must always rule in the best interests of the child. It's not in the best interest of my son to move to California to be transitioned to a girl.
Right.
So I went up to the Supreme Court of Texas. And the liberal establishment, liberal Republican establishment that rules Texas, decided that my son could move to California. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Texas said my son was at no greater risk of being transitioned to a girl in California than he would have been in Texas, which is patently ridiculous and obviously false. So what's happening basically among the states is you've got state family court judges are colluding with state judges in other liberal jurisdictions to move children into those jurisdictions to abuse them. And the Supreme Courts of those states are willing to go along with it.
Yeah, we have a similar situation here in South Carolina where we had a situation that's called, they're paying for kids. So basically the courts take the kids from the families, and then they are putting them in the foster care program and then adopting them out and making money off of that. It is atrocious. The way that our children are being handled is just
There are massive federal incentives, and I don't think a lot of people know this. Title 4D and Title 4E. Title 4D, every state has Title 4D courts. There's highly active courts. So what Title 4D does is it provides matching funds for the collection of child support from the federal government. And in Texas, we get about 2/3 back. It's about 66 cents on the dollar. In Texas, that represents about $500 million, and it completely funds the Texas Attorney General's office. And this is true in all the states. So this is a program that's larger than most defense programs.
Jeez.
And here's the thing. You only pay child support if you take the father out of the home.
Wow.
Or if you don't get 50-50 custody with both parents. So now the states have a $500 million financial incentive to always take children from their fathers. And
That's
if you ever
unbelievable.
wondered in family court why the judges always give the children to the incompetent parent, it's because they know the competent parent will pay, and therefore they'll get the matching funds, whereas the incompetent parent won't pay. They'd rather give the children to a heroin addict because they know they'll never get the matching funds from the heroin addict. And so that's what's really going on. The federal government is literally paying the states to break families up. Title 4E does the same thing for CPS takings, Child Protective Services, what we call them in Texas. And whenever they adopt out a child from CPS, they get about $250,000. So what happens in Texas is some little satellite office of Child Protective Service will get low on budget. They'll go look for low IQ parents, preferably white, preferably with no health issues, and they fabricate a reason to take their children and adopt them out, and they get $250,000 for the budget.
Oh my God.
It's just follow the money as usual.
Yes.
Now you mentioned the Texas Attorney General, that's Ken Paxton.
Yes.
What are his views on this, and has he been vocal about it?
He has. In fact, he put out an opinion. It's the longest Attorney General opinion in Texas history, 13 pages, where he determined that already under Texas law, it is child abuse to chemically castrate or physically castrate children.
Yes.
And yet the Supreme Court of Texas still wouldn't give me my sons back from California.
Oh my God. Listen, I grew up here in South Carolina. I'm a native of the state. And, I was a kid that grew up with a family of 6. I was the youngest of 6, 3 girls, 3 boys.
Mm-hmm.
My closest siblings were my twin brothers. And so they are 5 years older than me. So I learned very, very early on, if I was going to survive, I needed to be able to defend myself from my older brothers. And so I was a tomboy.
Right.
I mean, I climbed trees. I jumped out
Oh, they
of
would have
barns.
transitioned you today.
Exactly. And I could tell you right now, there are thousands upon hundreds of thousands of females just like myself who are now married and have children and are happy and all of those things. But if we had grown up in today's era, based on your story with your son, I mean, I understand your ex-wife is a pediatrician.
She's a pediatrician. Yeah.
So at 2 years of age, what compelled her to think that your son James was a girl trapped in a boy's body? I don't understand.
Well, we don't have to speculate. I mean, she was asked that at a 2019 trial, and under oath, here's what she said. She said that my son at Target saw a silver purse with a multicolored horse on it, and he said he wanted the purse, and she thought he might be a girl. And then he went at McDonald's and asked for the girl's toy and a Happy Meal, and that's what started her thinking that he might be a girl. And within 4 weeks, she had him in a dress. That's true. She swore to that.
Unbelievable. Now, Jeff, if I may, I mean, you mentioned something that I think might be at the core of all of this, especially when it comes to the government's involvement, and that is breaking up the family as a unit.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think this is just the latest in the litany of things that are aimed at doing exactly that?
Yeah. There's been a manufactured revolution in human anthropology. By anthropology, I mean the philosophy of what makes us a human being. And we've come to a place where most people think their sexual identity is their personal identity. And that's been a propaganda campaign that has been ongoing since actually the 50s.
Yes.
And so if you think of it that way, if people think that sexual identity is the primary identity of a person, you can see how a lot of the stuff they do makes some kind of perverse logic there. And this is all part of a plan to destroy the family. And the reason for that is very simple. If you've done any world travel, you know that there's only one place in the world that supports gun rights.
That's here.
And in America, there's only one group of people that supports gun rights. It's not the elites.
Right.
It's not the poor that are on welfare. It's only the American middle class.
Mm-hmm.
So the only bulwark of freedom left in the world anywhere is the American middle class. And they've tried everything all through the 1930s, 1940s. They tried after the Civil War in the South to try to destroy the Southern families. But they recognize one thing, that if you can turn women, their mothers, against the fathers and split them up, you can actually destroy the middle class in America. And this is one of the main ways to do it. This whole transgender movement with children is all being driven by women.
Yeah.
It's all mothers doing this. And it's either passive fathers or fathers like me who have to fight it. And it's just another step in the feminist assault on the family. Now, feminists will get really upset because a lot of feminists actually oppose the transgender movement, but I'm sorry to tell them that just strictly genealogically, from an intellectual point of view, if you just look at intellectual history, it was the feminist critique of gender which started all this.
You're right.
And it was intentional, and they were explicit. They said they were doing it in order to destroy the family.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. In fact, I had a discussion debate, if you will, with some feminists the other day. And I kind of said, listen, you guys, you're the one that started this. You started this snowball, and now you don't know how to stop it. But what you should be doing is at least going back and saying, okay, we made a mistake. Women cannot do everything guys can do. There is a definite divide in the two genders and what their roles should be. And oh, by the way, if you're not biologically a woman, you are not a woman.
That's right. And now they agree with that part, but kind of the mask slipped from feminism with the transgender movement. It's one of the good things we can say about the transgender movement is feminists stopped talking about equality, and they said, we want to maintain our sex-based rights. Yeah, that's exactly. Feminism is a female supremacy movement, and they were creating a system of rights which granted them all kinds of preferences. For example, they invaded male spaces all through the 70s and 80s and destroyed all male-only spaces.
Yes.
And now they're complaining that men are entering their spaces. Well, cry me a river.
Yeah, I remember here in South Carolina, speaking of those male spaces, we had the Citadel, which was at that time an all-male military university. And so there was a female, I think her name was Shannon, like mine. I can't remember her last name now. But anyway, she was attempting to get in, and they said, well, how about we send you to Wofford? They've got an ROTC program there. And so I kind of ran into her. And she was not a small young lady. And I, at that time, I was playing college sports. I was in pretty good shape. And I literally made the comment. I said, what is she running 6 miles and eating 12 donuts? I mean, I don't understand. But anyway, so yeah, she was kind of the precursor here in South Carolina to pushing that. And now, as you know, everything, West Point, all of the various academies are now open to men and women. And listen, I'm a veteran. I don't have any problem with women being involved in the military, but I have long been a person that said, don't make double standards. If you want to be in the military, then you better demonstrate that you have the physical stamina to do so. And I know it can be done because when I was in the service, I was outdoing most of the guys. I mean, I could do more push-ups, I could do more sit-ups than the average guy. Now, obviously, a guy who is fit is going to ghost me, and that should be the case. But I was not going to let I think our rule was we only had to do like 3 push-ups. It was something stupid. It was really bad. I said, no, I'm not going to. So I did like 80 push-ups and I did 120 sit-ups. I mean, and you had 2 minutes to do that in, by the way. So,
Oh yeah.
So
I was in the infantry.
So you get it. So I said, listen, okay, fine. You want to be in, you better demonstrate you have the ability. But I was opposed to putting women in combat units because of the psychological problems that are going to happen on the battlefield. I'm sorry, it's inborn that you're going to be protective over your sisters or whatever. And so in a battle situation, you got a commander who's got to make a decision on who to send. And he's looking at the 2 choices and he's like, well, I can't send her. I mean, that's my little sister. So those aren't decisions that should be even having to be contemplated. But anyway, I digress. We definitely don't want this to be the norm as it is becoming. So, where are you at in the process? What can we do to make sure that this doesn't continue to happen? What recourse do you have, if any, at this point?
Well, if you look at how family courts are constructed, both in Texas and South Carolina, there's almost no recourse out of these courts. They have created a system in which a single judge can make a judgment, and there's just no oversight over that judgment at all. That's the first thing that we need to change. And one of the easy ways to do that is just to make family courts normal civil courts and let people appeal out of them just like any other court. The other thing is, people need to really take seriously elections of judges, which they don't.
Well, here we don't elect judges. I don't know.
We don't have that.
They're appointed.
So we have two states in our union, ourselves in Virginia, where they're appointed. And here our legislatures, they essentially appoint these guys. And most of those legislators are themselves attorneys. So that's a conflict of interest. And we're working to fix that.
So, yeah, I think before I'd elect a senator, I'd like to know who he's going to appoint. And
it's a pretty big thing. Now, I wanted to ask you about the medical side of this.
Yeah.
There are some states who are using the legal process, the legislative process, to establish laws that would basically prohibit any type of gender reassignment surgery on anybody under 18. How many states, do you know offhand how many states have passed those laws? I was reading that South Dakota had one that was.
There's 5 states that I'm aware of.
5 states?
Yeah. And let me tell you what they're doing. And this is a classic liberal establishment Republican move. They always fool the base with this kind of approach. What they're doing is they're prohibiting doctors from performing these procedures. Okay. What they're not doing is classifying it legally as child abuse.
And that's what it needs
because
to
they
be.
want to allow parents, like in Texas, you can just fly your kid up to Colorado and chop his dick off.
It's
Okay.
bad.
So, and it's perfectly legal to do that to a child because it wasn't done in Texas. It wasn't done by a Texas doctor. What needs to happen is this needs to be classified as child abuse in Republican states. So parents can't remove their children to go do this. But these Republicans won't do it. They will not do that. It's the same thing they do with the abortion laws. Like a lot of people think that Texas banned abortion. We didn't stop a single abortion with our laws. They are experts at crafting bills that fool the base into thinking they did something when they didn't do anything. And that's what most of these states have done. They simply banned doctors from doing it.
Yeah, I know here in South Carolina, as I noted in the beginning, we're not. I mean, we're supposed to be the super red state. In fact, we have a quote unquote super majority of Republicans. Right. The problem is the majority of the Republicans are not Republicans. They're Democrats. We just redistrict. And so they created a new district due to the population influx. And so we created District 61. And the young lady that took that seat, her name is Carla Schusler, and I have a copy of her Democratic Horry County Party membership, and she volunteered to work with Hillary Clinton. Not only would she not answer any of my questions, because I sent her a message and say, please, Carla, tell me, when did you have the epiphany and realize, oh my God, I'm not really a Hillary supporter, I'm a Donald Trump supporter. She didn't respond. And in fact, she denied vehemently to everybody else that she was ever a Democrat. Then we have Luke Rankin, who's our senator, who actually sits on the Judicial Committee that does appoint the judges. And he was a Democrat from the 1990s until 2004, when he realized he couldn't run as a Democrat and get elected. So he just said, okay, I'm a Republican. But he votes. Yep. His voting record is less conservative than 2 other named Democrats.
Yeah, and that's a consistent pattern in Republican politics. It's the same in Texas.
Yep. So
the Speaker of the House of the state of Texas is Dade Phelan, and he is a radical homosexual activist.
Wow.
And this pattern happens, and I'm going to have to, there's just no way for me to like throw a softball on this one. The problem is Republican voters are stupid.
Yeah.
Our voters are objectively inferior to Democrat voters. Democrat voters don't tolerate people who don't attempt to pursue their policy agenda. They will throw them out on a dime. They also don't really get caught up in the purity spirals that Republicans get caught up in. I mean, they would have put if they knew Hillary Clinton was a child murderer, they would have still elected her because she would have got their policy agenda done.
Yes.
So Republicans get caught up in purity spirals, and the left knows that. So they create the purity spirals by manufacturing fake news about Republican candidates, and some people we know that's happened to right there in South Carolina.
Absolutely.
Happened to me when I ran for office here in Texas as well. Happened to a lot of grassroots candidates. That's a formula they use to beat Republicans. They split the Republican vote down on some fake moral issue, and then they bring in Democrat voters to make up the difference for the establishment candidate. And I'm sorry to say that Republican voters fall for this every time.
Yep.
And I just gave a speech in South Dallas County where I explained to people I gave them 4 exact ways in which the liberal establishment tricks you into thinking that they're conservative. And these people really just had a really difficult time with that. It's hard for them to believe that the people that they've supported are not really conservatives. And unfortunately, Democrat voters are much wiser than ours, and that's why we're losing.
Yeah, and then on top of that, here in South Carolina, we have to deal with the open primaries. So very often what happens is you have Democrats vote in the Republican primary, and we end up, out of that primary, you get what I call squishy Republican. You get a squishy Republican, and then in November, the base has to go out and hold their nose and vote for that Republican.
Right.
So we have it's double-edged here.
Yeah, we have open primaries in Texas too.
Yeah,
I can't understand why they let that continue. I mean, I came from New York a couple of years ago, and even New York knows better than that.
Yes, I know. Well, the Republican establishment gets a lot of power from that, right? What it means is that if the state ever flips Democrat or the state stays Republican, it won't matter. The establishment people will stay in power, no matter what party's in power. That's why it's so hard to
cross over, right?
Yeah, that's why it's so hard to change it. We have tried to change open primaries here in Texas so many times. You can't even get it to go to a committee. The leadership just will not allow it through.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to kind of go back to what you said about Republican voters, if you will, and I just want to clarify a little bit, folks. It's not that he's saying you're stupid as if you don't have any IQ. It's saying that you are so ill-informed. And I'll give you a great example. My husband, I love him dearly. He is a very brilliant man. I mean, I was telling John the other day that at the time when the SAT was 1600, he scored a 1580, and he didn't even try. He was a Patriot missile defense officer in the Army, so literally his job was rocket science. So he's a smart man, and you ask him any question on the national level, he can tell you whatever you want to know. Very smart. But the other night, I just wanted to use his knowledge as an example, and so I asked him. I said, can you name who our state House representative is for our district? And he said, no, I only know our federal. And I said, so you don't know who our state senator is either? He said, no. So the point being, he's probably in the top 1% of intellectuals in the state of South Carolina. He's just very smart, but he doesn't know who our state representatives are. And that is across the board. The problem, they don't know who their state representatives are. They don't know where they stand on the issues. And the only time they even come up with a vote for them is when they get to the primary. And then again, we're talking about less than 1% of the voting constituent even bothers to go to the primary.
That's right.
And all they do is they say, oh, well, this guy's been in office for X number of years, so he must be a Republican, so I'll vote for him.
Right.
And that's what they do time and time again. So that's the reason why John and I decided to create this podcast, Palmetto Politics, is because we want to start informing the electorate to let them know you have been, I don't know what's the word, tricked, whatever you want to call it. And we're trying to out the tricksters. And luckily we're a state that has the South Carolina Freedom Caucus. And so they're working diligently. They're true conservatives. The majority of them are, even within the Freedom Caucus. We got a few folks, Bobby Cox being one, who their votes leave me baffled. But we are making some headway, and I feel like I'm reaching out to Turning Point USA. I'm reaching out to, Charlie Kirk. I'm reaching out to Dan Bongino, to Glenn Beck, and some other groups. I am trying diligently to create a nationwide effort to focus on state politics, because the truth of the matter is, guys, let's look at our two senators. Both Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott got their beginnings in the state legislature here in South Carolina. Our current U.S. Congressman for District 7, Mr. Russell Fry, got his start in the South Carolina state legislature. The congressman before him, Mr. Tom Rice, got his start as the chairman for the county council. So all of these federal officers, there are some exceptions, but majority, I'm talking 90%, start out at a state or local office and then make their way up. I mean, you got the AOCs of the world, but there ain't many of those, thank God. So if we can show folks these guys and girls are not conservative. They're not Republican. We can save ourselves a lot of heartache, both at the state level and at the national level, by simply not voting them in. And that's going to make a tremendous difference. Now, I know Dan Bongino, I think, probably has one of the best quotes out there. And he said, listen, most Republicans are Democrats, but no Democrats are Republican.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the truth.
Yeah, that's right. And the first of all, the states matter more because the state laws are the ones you actually really live under, unless something crazy is going on or you're involved in a regulated industry. The other thing is nothing can get done at the federal level. Right. What Donald Trump showed us was that the federal government is not under the control of elected officials. I mean, he ordered our troops out of Syria, and the military actually disobeyed his orders. They didn't do it. He ordered military parades every year of his presidency on July 4th. The DOD refused to do it. So we know that the president is not the commander in chief of the military. He's not in control of the military. He's not in control of the agencies. We know Donald Trump ordered the IRS to stop those audits of the middle class, and they continued preparing for that for the next administration. So we know that what really runs the federal government are the agencies and the heads of the agencies, and they're not under control of elected officials or of the people. So you're not going to get anything done at the federal level anyway. Right. Your best bet is to go at the state and county level. County commissioner courts are very important. A lot of Republicans don't get this, but all state and federal money that gets spent in the United States is spent by commissioner courts. So they have the power to determine exactly how money is spent in your county. It's one of the most important elected officials, and nobody really pays any attention to them. The only constitutional law enforcement officer is a sheriff. Everything else is created by statute.
Yes.
And people don't pay attention to that either. Sheriffs have a lot of power. In Louisiana, the sheriff and the county commissioner are one person. So they have a tremendous amount of power. So focusing on county and state is definitely the way to go. I think we have a more fundamental problem, though, and I don't really know how to address it. I've been thinking about it a lot. There's something about the attitudes and dispositions of conservative voters that's made them extremely vulnerable to the propaganda from the left. The left has really, for example, conservatives have a natural desire for social order because we know the consequences of the loss of social order.
Yes.
And so we're all willing to make compromises to maintain peace and order in our communities. So the left can selectively disturb that social order and force us into compromise positions so that we regain that sense of order that we desire. And they can do this over and over again until there's just nothing left. That's exactly what they did with the transgender issue, with the gay marriage issue. They have really perfected a propaganda system that works against conservative dispositions. So we need to somehow figure out a way to inoculate conservatives against that propaganda. And I just haven't figured out a good way to approach that.
Yeah. And of course, you have to deal with the complicit media because they're just the communications arm of the left wing. And, you just talked about local stuff. There is a bill pending here, and it was shown on the news this morning. And of course, it had the built-in bias, which it was about the drag queen shows. For Children's Story Hour and things like that. Don't you think that that's just the liberals, the left's way of kind of softening this whole argument, saying, 100%. Oh, look, this is just harmless. And look, ultimately, drag queen shows have been part of our society forever.
Right.
But they're adult themed.
Yes.
They're adult themed. So this bill, when I read it, is basically aimed at preventing children from being at these types of shows, especially if they're sexualized shows. Yeah. But don't you think that's just the soft underbelly of this same argument?
Oh, no doubt. The larger thing that's going on with the left, and they've been very successful in doing this, is the left got rid of Skid Row. All of our towns, our big cities, even moderately sized cities, had something called Skid Row. Many of your listeners may not even know what I'm talking about. Skid Row was where all the drunks and drug users and prostitutes and pimps and drag queens, they all went to Skid Row, and the police kind of had an uneasy truce in Skid Row that as long as you don't invade the public spaces which need to be safe for families,
where the good people are,
we'll kind of overlook this place. And the thing about Skid Row, there was always a Roman Catholic church and a Protestant church, usually a Lutheran church, in Skid Row. and always there to give a helping hand to pull anybody out of Skid Row that wanted to come out of it. But there was a place where these people could go. Well, unfortunately, the left is just as stupid. I mean, I use that word stupid a lot. The left is just as stupid too. They're ideologically stupid. So they conceived of Skid Row as a location, a place, rather than a state of mind.
Right.
And so they thought, well, if we can get rid of Skid Row, then we can get rid of the state of mind, because they're all social constructionists, right?
Yes.
So that's why in places like San Francisco, Austin, Dallas, what happened was Skid Row just invaded the rest of the city.
Right.
Right? They're still degenerates. They're still moral degenerates. They're still drug users. There's still prostitution. They just invaded all the suburbs and all the inner cities, and they came out of Skid Row because they destroyed Skid Row. So the drag show thing is basically an attempt to normalize the behavior that was in Skid Row in a morally degenerate society and normalize it for our society. And this propaganda method is very well understood. They tested it in the 1990s. That's how we got gay marriage, right? They started seeding it into sitcom programs. They started seeding it into movies. And people began to sort of get accustomed to this slowly. And it took them about 10 years to do of this kind of propaganda to get gay marriage. But I want you to think about the transgender phenomena. It only took them from 2016 to 2019. It took them 3 years
Right.
to do that. So that tells me that their propaganda power is increasing, not decreasing.
Yes.
But the larger program is to turn all of society into Skid Row.
Yeah, when I was a kid, that was one of the things that was sort of like what do you want to end up on Skid Row?
Yes,
you got that, and you're going to end up digging ditches. And those are your two, like, oh my God.
If society is inundated with this Skid Row culture, it's very easy to have a communist revolution.
Yes.
I mean, it creates the preconditions of what the communists call alienation.
Correct.
And once you have social alienation, you have the context for revolt.
Right. And of course, it goes back to what you're talking about, where you're basically eliminating the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
You have your oligarchs at the top, and then you have everybody at the lower end. And I heard my friend David Zier say it on television the other day. He said basically what you have in Manhattan is you have the wealthy, stepping over the homeless people to make sure they get their Starbucks in the
That's
morning.
right.
You just step over them. And that's exactly what the goal is.
That, no doubt about it. And that is also a condition where you have a rich, I'm going to use the Marxist terminology. You have a rich capitalist class and an undertrodden proletariat, then you can get a revolt. You can get a revolution. But with the middle class, you can't get a revolution because they value social order. So they have to destroy it. They have to destroy it.
And I know John and I are both retired history teachers, so you're speaking our language. Gotcha. It just, how do we get people to see this? How do we get them to wake up and see what's been happening since the 50s? Really, actually, even prior to the 50s, but definitely launched into, World War II ended, and boy, they just kicked. It's like they brought all those European ideas here, and it just became, intransient. We can't get rid of it, and it's just
a lot of people don't know Wilson was educated at the Sorbonne, and he brought all those ideas back here. So first of all, I think we have to get our head around something that's a little different. Like Republicans often say we need to do voter education. And I think education is the wrong frame for it. What we need to think of is counter propaganda. How did the Voice of America counter communist propaganda in Europe?
With all the radio broadcasts.
Yeah. And they didn't use just education techniques. Right. So if you think of it as counter propaganda, you'll widen the scope of the tools that you need to use. It also forces you to think of the other side as utilizing propaganda. Like we often think as conservatives, well, we need to make better arguments. We need to win. Well, look, I'm going to tell you, with gay marriage, we won the argument.
Right.
Gay marriage came up for a vote in 48 states, and it was voted down in all 48 states. And it was voted down in California twice by a plurality of gay people. Gay people didn't want gay marriage, okay? But we still got gay marriage through the courts. They imposed it on us through the courts, okay? So making better arguments isn't going to win. It's not going to win. It's a propaganda war. It's an information war, and you have to think of it that way. Another way, when I was on the campaign trail here in Texas, I would tell people, like, we're in a cold civil war. It's cold because it's not kinetic. We're just using words right now.
Right.
It's a civil war because it's a contest over who's going to rule, right? Who's going to
Yes.
rule the country. And it's a war because only one can win.
Correct.
It's either going to be us or them. You know, when Lincoln said a house divided against itself cannot stand, he did not mean that one side had to be defeated. He actually tried to avoid that language during his presidential campaign. What he meant was the house is either going to become all slave or no slave.
Correct.
There was no middle ground in the house. We have the same problem here. The house divided against itself cannot stand. We're either going to become all leftist or all conservative. And we have to give up our illusions as conservatives that we can come to consensus and come to some reasonable, negotiation with the left. The left has to be destroyed in the United States by any means necessary.
And I think, what you said about education, I agree with you, but I also think that historically, especially recently, Republicans in general do a terrible job of going out into communities where they don't think they're going to get any votes. They just won't go there, and they will not exchange ideas with people who may be very receptive to their ideas. Like when I campaigned, not to make this about me, but because I was running in an 8-1 Democrat-Republican district, I had to go basically into the belly of the beast and start talking to people about things that they normally don't get to talk about. And when you get into that position, you realize that we're a lot closer to heavily Democrat voter communities than we think. And I think that's something that has to be exposed as well. I think the party, at least especially the Freedom Caucus, they're the type of people who will go into the communities that vote historically democratically, particularly communities where there are people of color, and say, look, we agree on all of this stuff.
Right.
And the rest of it right now is just noise. So do you think that's a major part of the problem as well?
Well, I have to say I don't. I think, look, I just, when I tell you I spoke at the South Dallas Republican Club, I spoke to a Black Republican club.
Right.
And the Republican Party in Texas was founded by 9 Black men. Okay. So we have a long history of that here in Texas. But the issue is this, it's really astonishing. The most socially conservative demographic in the United States is Black men.
Yes.
They are the most against abortion, the most against transgender, and so forth. But I would encourage you to go and read some of the books written by Black leaders in the 1930s when they stopped voting Republican. There was a shift in the Black voting from Republican to Democrats in the late 1930s. And read the reasons for that. And it basically came down to welfare programs. And it's just something that I just don't think we can get past. Either that, or we're going to have to accept a welfare state and start pursuing welfare state. I'm a realist. I'm a realist about these things. So I talked to in the 1990s and 80s, I lived in Black neighborhoods specifically to do Republican outreach in Houston. Okay. So I've been down this road many times. Trump did better than anybody. And showed that we can definitely make inroads. But the problem is we have such a huge number of people that are beholden to Democrat welfare programs. It's very difficult to convince people to do that. The thing we have to come to grips with that we don't like to talk about, the voting base for the Republican Party is white men. The swing vote for Republicans are white women.
Yes.
And the number one factor that affects the swing is whether they're married or not.
You are
married
right.
white women swing Republican by large numbers. Unmarried white women swing to the Democrats by large numbers. Amongst married women with children, you're in 80% Republican territory. So you would think the Republican Party would prioritize pro-marriage policies.
You would think.
Right. So we have a guy, Brian Slayton. He's a good friend of mine here in Texas that just introduced tax breaks for people who get married and have one child. By the time you get to 6 children, you're basically paying no taxes in Texas.
Wow.
So the idea is to encourage marriage. And we can look to places like Hungary and Poland and look at the policies that they've done to achieve replacement birth rates in their countries.
incentivizing families.
Yes. And we disincentivize families.
I was just going to say, we disincentivize, yes.
Listen, if you talk to young men right now, they have all seen their fathers be divorce raped.
Yep.
They've seen their brothers be divorce raped. These young men are not going to marry.
They're saying that's bearing out in the numbers. I mean, I'm watching multiple different programs, and they're talking about the youth right now, the men. They're not only are they not getting married, they're just asexual. They don't want to even date.
That's correct.
So
they've
very problematic.
They've seen what's happened to their fathers. So we're now on 2 generations that have been through this experiment with no fault divorce and so forth, and they've seen the results of it. So we need to have pro-marriage, pro-family legislation that incentivizes being married and staying married.
Yes.
And if we do that, we'll have a majority of Republican voters. But I think we have to just accept, we don't like it, but we just have to accept that white men are the voting base. And we had better think about having policies that keep that voting base, because I know a lot of young white men are migrating to the Democratic Party because they feel that the Republican Party is not addressing their interests around family formation.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why you see the left attacking the family so much, and as you just noted, attacking white males.
100%. It's the voting base, the Republican Party. That's where they want if they can split husbands from wives, you'll always have a Democrat majority.
Yeah, because the women are going to voting Democrat, and the men are just going to give up. So, I mean, those are all just it's kind of heavy. So for our folks watching and viewing even later, but this is all truth, and it's not something that people are aware of, but it's something that we need to make them aware of, and then we need to fix it. We've got to overcome this. And I agree with you. We can't simply say, well, we can't have welfare anymore. It's got to go away, because I don't think it's realistic.
It's not realistic if you want to stay in power, right?
Yeah, because they're gonna, if you throw grandma off the cliff, they're not.
We ought to be using wedge issues, which amazingly Republicans just never use. The transgender issue is a major wedge issue, okay? Because blacks really don't like the transgender thing.
Right.
Why aren't we using that as a wedge issue against Democrats, pulling off black voters, right? Immigration is a big deal because immigrants soak up that welfare program, and it doesn't go to blacks and Hispanics in this country who are citizens.
Right.
And then we can take that nationalist message. Like, the whole thing about nationalism is you think of your nation as an extended family and you take care of them first. Right. And
that's what Trump was pushing. That's why he won.
That's right.
That's what America first is.
That's right. So, we need to take care of our underprivileged black citizens before we ever take care of these fake refugees from down south.
Amen.
And we need to say it like that. And that's the kind of message that can work, but the problem is it has to be backed up by action, and Republicans just typically don't take action. Let me give you an example. I love Rand Paul. Don't take me wrong. This isn't against Rand Paul. I could do Lindsey Graham all day, but I'm not going to do that because out of respect for the men from South Carolina who fought at the Alamo, I will not criticize your elected officials.
We'll do that for you.
Yeah. So, by the way, their names are inscribed on the epitaph, and I would say 1 million prayers a year are said for those South Carolinians that fought at the Alamo. Thank you for that. We wouldn't have an independent Texas without those men. So, you look at these hearings they're having. So you'll get on Twitter, you'll see people say, these elected officials like Rand Paul say, "Hey, I just tore up the Moderna CEO in a hearing." Yeah, well, so what? Yeah. That's a propaganda operation. They're using harsh words to make you think they did something. But here's the question. Where's the bill that ends their lawsuit immunity?
Yeah. Thank you. That's what I want to see.
And let's be honest about it. Who gave these companies lawsuit immunity? Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan did that. Okay. And this is where we have to also start coming down on some ideas that Republican voters don't like to think about. They like to think of themselves as free market capitalists, right? But the Republicans that we've elected over the years have not pursued free markets.
Amen.
Okay. They've gone after crony capitalism. We don't let companies have no immunity for what they do. That can never be a good idea. As soon as you remove personal responsibility from anybody, even a corporation, you're creating a recipe for immoral behavior. And everybody knows that. So my question to Rand Paul is, great, fiery speech. I love it. You roasted him. Great. He deserves to be roasted. But it won't do anything until you pass a law taking away their immunity. Absolutely. We just had all of these hearings about the FBI. Great. Where's the bill to defund the FBI, destroy the organization, and rebuild it? Let's create another one, right? Called something else besides the FBI, and let's rehire all the agents. And let's make sure that the law specifies that the screening criteria, while it meets all the neutrality requirements for federal employment, make sure liberals don't get hired again. Because let me tell you something. I took the test to work for the State Department. You have to take an exam.
Right.
And they don't have to follow EEOC rules. So they can ask you, do you believe in abortion? Have you ever aborted a child? Have you ever been pregnant? They can ask you those questions, and they do. And that test to join the State Department is basically, am I a liberal test?
Yes.
And if you're not a liberal, they don't hire you.
Yeah.
They don't hire you.
Yeah, those are the things that have to be looked at, because, and we talk about this all the time here, we call the government the onion. You peel the onion, and what do you get? You get more onion. I mean, there's so many layers to this, but it has to be done. I mean, and as you talked about the FBI being defunded, we're not talking about getting rid of the FBI. We don't want to get rid of federal law enforcement, but there needs to be a major reorganization from the top down. Same thing with the pharmaceutical companies that you talked about. That's another thing we talk about all the time here when we talk about free market capitalism. If they were out of class that day in Economics 101, in free market capitalism, there's an inherent fairness built into it.
Correct.
That's really the government's role, is to make sure that it's a level playing field, and then they're supposed to get out of the way.
Yeah.
But that's not what they do. It's far from what they do.
No, absolutely not. All we need is a stable system of contracting. That's all we need to have a free market.
Milton Friedman, right.
But what's actually going on is the government picks winners. Do you think it's an accident that if you're a conservative like me, you have zero chance of getting venture capital funding for a tech venture? It'll never happen. Oh, yeah. You'll never get venture capital funding. That's not an accident. Is it an accident that the CIA's In-Q-Tel venture capital fund? Did y'all know that the CIA has its own venture capital fund?
I did not.
In-Q-Tel.
Wow.
And In-Q-Tel invested in Facebook, Twitter, Google. It was one of the first round funders of Google. They pick winners and then magically these guys get all the government contracts, which lets them grow and become successful and beat their competitors. And then we find out that, they start censoring people. Like these social media companies and search engine companies were actually fostered and grown by the federal government specifically for censorship, because the government can't do it. So they invested in companies that could do it. So we don't live in a free market here. This is another thing that, I usually don't go down the rabbit hole this deep with normie conservatives, but we don't live under the Constitution. It doesn't restrain the government at all.
Yep.
Constitutional arguments are useless. They're not going to stop anything. And we don't live under a free market. Winners are picked.
You're absolutely right.
Winners are picked. So we have to act as though we're under conditions of oppression. We have to act as though we're under conditions of oppression, not pretending our rights are protected. And that's what conservatives haven't gotten their head around.
I'll give you a great example right here in South Carolina. There's our Republican legislature and our Republican governor. They just put forth legislation to give Volkswagen / Scout. They adopted the Scout name to produce electric vehicles here in South Carolina. They gave them a check gave Volkswagen a check for $400 million of taxpayer money, and gave them about $1.5 billion in tax incentives to open their business here. That's going to create 4,000 jobs. And then this morning I wake up and find that Ford is announcing a $6 billion loss on electric vehicles. So, Ford is going to go with their hat in their hand and say, hey, look, we need some supplemental money here.
You gave this foreign company. Can't you help us?
Yeah, can't you help us out? And they're going to go to the federal government, taxpayer money again, and they're going to ask for incentives. Meanwhile, the federal government has already given tons of incentives to people to try to get them to buy these battery-operated vehicles that nobody wants to drive in the first place, at least not around here. Right. And you can see that you're picking winners and losers, and invariably, guess what the government does? They pick losers.
They always pick losers.
But it's losers that benefit their cronies. That's the whole problem, and that's what crony capitalism is.
Yeah, 100%. That's what it is. Same with the banks. Same with real estate. Conservatives at some point, we could delve down into the money system and how the money system is equally controlled. It's not just capital, but one thing that I think everybody, even normie conservatives who are listening, could see themselves is that everything has been financialized.
Yes.
They can't, I don't think that people can even imagine how banking was done in the late 1800s and early 20th century. Banks didn't loan money to businesses. They bought stock in those businesses. They had a stake in whether they succeeded or failed.
Right. Exactly.
But
Yeah.
now with
game, right?
everything has been financialized into loans and packaged up into derivative swaps and so forth. And because everything's been financialized, there's usurious interest that's charged on everything. And it just goes ripples throughout the entire economy. And it's, you talk about Milton Friedman. This is one of the big things Milton Friedman talked about was the manipulation of interest rates and the cost of money throughout the economy. And it's just made it impossible for small business people. They don't want small business people.
Right.
They don't want those people.
Middle class, right? Middle class.
They don't want them. Yeah, they don't want them because those people are not controllable.
Right.
Like you're exempt from EEOC laws, even if you're under 15
funny you should say that, because literally I own a small business, and about 3 weeks ago I went to my local small bank, and to pursue a business loan, and I was approved, and so I had to do a few more things, and I'm not making this up. Then we had the SVB and then the Credit Suisse, and guess what? I cannot get my banker to call me back.
Yep.
Will not call me back. So I said, well, I guess that means
my
my loan that was approved is no longer a thing.
That's right. Well, I thought there was an image in Texas when remember when the PPP program came out, where we were doing bailouts of all these companies, and a bailout for companies specifically because of a stupid government shutdown policy, right? So they create the conditions to give bailouts to these companies. So when Texas announced the PPP program, the governor came out and he appointed someone to head up the program, right? To distribute the funds in Texas. President of Goldman Sachs.
Right.
Just says all you need to know. Says all you need to know. They, no offense, John, but they send down these northern carpetbaggers down here.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
And it all went to big businesses. Small businesses got nothing. One of the things that we could do on these so-called bailouts that would probably assuage everyone, but it would achieve conservative results, is give the bailouts to consumers. Right. All the money should have gone to consumers, because consumers would then have patronized businesses, thus bailing them out. But consumers would have the choice of what businesses. And so only the businesses that were meeting customer needs would have been patronized.
Buyers and
but they'll never do that because they want their cronies to get paid. They don't want any kind of free market. If the closest thing to free market you can get on bailouts is to just give the money to consumers and let them spend it.
I agree. That makes too much sense. But you're right. We're supposed to not pick winners and losers, which we do. And that's the best way. If you want to pick winners and losers, as you said, give the money to we the people, and then we'll go pick the winners and losers. And the losers lose because they're not doing the job that we need them to do.
Yep.
Right. That's right.
Now, before we get out of here, because we're running out of time, I wanted to get back to the issue with your son and other children who are in the same situation. What is the federal government's role here? Because I don't have to tell you, once you cross state lines, you've involved the federal government. Does the federal government have a role here? And is there anybody in Congress who's pushing these things? I know Marjorie Taylor Greene is pretty hot and heavy on this, but is there any pending legislation to try to get the federal government involved? I mean, I hate to do that, but if the states aren't going to do it, somebody's got to do it.
Nobody has filed a bill at the federal level. There's been lots of talk as usual, but nobody's filed a bill. The bottom line is this is child abuse.
I'm disappointed in Ted Cruz. Let me just say that right now.
Well, hey, we've been saying that for years. Look at the law school he went to. Another guy that talks a lot, but when you look at actual bills that get filed and bills that he can actually get passed, just doesn't happen. And who are they voting for speaker? Mitch McConnell.
I know.
And who are the nutbags in Kentucky that keep electing Mitch McConnell? Again, it comes down to Republican. Yeah. It comes down to Republican voters. Who are these idiot Republican voters electing Mitch McConnell over and over again? And he's destroying our country. But there's no federal legislation on the transgender issue. What they want to do is talk a lot about it, make it seem like they're against it, and then do nothing about it. And that's exactly what they tried to do in Texas for 6 years. But I forced them to do something. We'll probably get a bill in Texas that will prevent doctors from doing the procedures. But there needs to be a nationwide focus on this. This is child abuse. It needs to be classified as child abuse. During my 2019 trial, the top experts on both sides of the transgender issue showed up at this little courthouse in Texas.
Right.
Johanna Olsen Kennedy runs the largest gender clinic that mutilates more children in America than any other clinic. I deposed her and I asked her a very simple question. I asked her, what is the medical justification for removing healthy body parts from children? And she looked me straight in the eye and said on video, if they cause psychological distress, they're not healthy body parts. So these kinds of practices are not going to stop. The medical community is all behind them. Don't forget, the Endocrine Society supports it. The American Academy of Pediatrics supports it. The American Medical Association supports it. All of the psychological boards in all the states support it. Your state board of psychology does not allow psychologists to help children identify with their biological sex.
Right. That's child abuse in itself, according to them.
Because they consider that reparative therapy. And by their rules, they don't allow psychologists to do that. So they can only help a child be transgendered. That's all they're allowed to do.
That's all. So all the money.
I know all the professional organizations are completely on board with it. So the only way to counter that is to make it child abuse. And if the bills that your listeners see don't classify these transgender procedures on children as child abuse, it's not a real bill. It's an attempt to fool you into thinking they did something when they didn't.
Right, because you're absolutely right. They'll just simply go to a state like California or New York where it's perfectly allowed.
That's right.
And have the surgery done there and come back, and there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, it's very similar to abortion. Like right. So, we passed all these bills on abortion here in Texas, but they waited until almost all abortions are chemical abortions. Yeah. So you go to a Planned Parenthood clinic and they prescribe the drugs. They have a little tray they pass it through, and it's all videotaped so that it can be shown that the doctor did not administer the pill. The mother takes the pill out of the container and takes the pill and kills the baby. Okay. Well, in Texas, it's not illegal for mothers to kill their babies. It's illegal for doctors to perform the procedures. Okay. But it's okay for mothers to do it. And mothers do it. We have the same number of abortions as we had before. It's just mothers killing their babies instead of doctors. So they're very good at fooling you into thinking that they've done something when they haven't done something. And they're trying to pull the same thing they've done with abortion, they're trying to do with the transgender issue. They're going to say, oh, yeah, we don't let doctors do it. Oh, yeah, but you can fly your kid down to Costa Rica and chop his balls off.
I want to go back to your ex-wife. I mean, she's a doctor, and obviously when you guys met, she couldn't have been as liberal thinking as she is now. I don't think you would have married her based on the conversation we've had thus far.
We were delegates to the Texas Republican Party convention.
So I mean, what do you think happened that made her suddenly think, well, I want to be a part of this leftist? It's inexplicable to me.
I don't think she was ever considered. I actually think she fooled me. And I think there's a common thing with California liberal women. They'll, instead of using a sperm donor, they'll just get a man on the hook and they pay child support and then they take the kids. I think it was planned from the very beginning, and it was planned that at around 2 years old, she'd split up and take the kids. And I just think it was something set up from the very beginning.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that, but that makes the most sense. And I think I told you there was a family member, my mother-in-law. She has a very good friend that his grandchildren, born twin boys, and the mother, not his daughter, but his son, it was his son, so his son's wife, decided she wanted to have a little girl, but she didn't want to be pregnant again. So from birth, they treated one of the boys as a girl. So they, immediately, from the time it was born, they have dressed him like a girl. And I'm sure at this point in time, because they're probably about your son's age, I'm sure at this point in time, they have been giving the chemical castration, if not having gone on to the next level. And it's gut wrenching to think about that.
Yeah. And, there's again, I'm going to try to relate this back to the propaganda stuff we're talking about. I always ask people to think about the most dystopian society you can imagine. For me, that'd be something like North Korea.
Right.
But for you, maybe that's the 1984 Brave New World, whatever dystopian nightmare society you can think of. Do you believe that you could torture a father into believing that his son was a girl? Now, I think you could torture a father into saying it.
Right.
But could you torture him into believing it? I actually doubt that you could.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
The propaganda regime in this country is so powerful that they have over 40% of the country actually believing that. So I submit to you that the propaganda power of the left in America is larger than the tyrannous power of even North Korea.
I
That
think
our
you're right.
enemies are extremely powerful. It only took them about 6 years to get 40% of the country into believing this stuff, to the point where they'll literally take kids into surgery and cut their genitals off and think it's a good thing. Like, you have to think about how powerful the propaganda has to be to make someone do that to their own child. And that just tells you everything you need to know about what we have to do to fight it.
Yeah, even the discussion about the idea that you talk to people and say, "Are you non-binary?" I mean, that whole concept is relatively brand new.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, 10, 15 years ago, you asked the general population, do you consider yourself male, female, gay, straight, bi, whatever? And it was something like 1 to 3% would have said they were anything other than male or female. And now I believe the number somewhere in the 20 percentile range of people who identify as non-binary or some
Yes.
other. And that is it's
It's a
shocking.
worldview that's just, for most conservatives, they can't step into. And unfortunately for me, because of what's happened with my son, I've had to step into the intellectual world of the left and attempt to understand it from their point of view. But like I said earlier, and I don't recommend that to anyone, by the way.
Right.
If you think of a person's identity as being mostly defined by their sexuality, which is what the left believes, your sexual identity is almost your complete identity. It makes sense when you look at children and they don't have a sexual identity. They haven't gone through puberty yet. They have no sexual identity. To the left, they look at children and they don't look like persons.
Right.
Children don't look like persons to the left because they have no identity by their definition. And so what they feel they have to do is impose an identity on children in order to make them full persons.
Yeah.
And that idea that that your identity is inextricably linked to your sexual identity arose in the 1950s and is largely a result of Sigmund Freud's ideas, where he basically just took communist theory and applied it to psychology.
That happened everywhere. Education.
Yeah.
All of that. Dewey. Yeah.
Yeah. And this idea of your identity as being sexual identity just took off. Now, the other thing that the left believes is that you can create your own identity.
Yes.
Right. And so that must entail then that you can create your own sexual identity, because that's what comprises human identity.
Yes.
And that's where these kinds of weird ideas come from. But because we come from a world in which your identity isn't at all tied to your, if you'd have gone to my grandfather, this is a guy who mowed 5 acres with a scythe.
Wow.
Right to the day he died. Okay. I mean, he could outwork me in his 80s. Literally, he could work me into the dirt in his 80s. If you went to this guy and said, "Do you feel fulfilled in your work?" You probably spent half an hour trying to explain the meaning of the question. Work was just a way for him to feed his family. Fulfillment didn't even enter his mind.
The equation. Yeah.
And if you asked him, how do you feel about your sexual identity? He would go, "Well, I have kids." He wouldn't even understand what you're talking about.
Right.
Like there is a world that has emerged in the minds of our youth, put there by crazy educators, that puts their sexual identity at the center of the universe. All things stem from their sexual identity. I had a discussion with an NBC News producer one time, and he tried to trick me. I think he was secretly recording me. He said, "Well, Jeff, are you a Christian?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm an Orthodox Christian." And he said, "Well, can I come to your church?" I'm like, "Absolutely." It's Saturday. I said, "Come to church tomorrow. We're having church tomorrow. It's Sunday." And he said, "But I'm gay." Like a big gotcha. I think he was recording it. And I said, well, then you should come to church first, because first of all, you need to stop being gay. It's bad for you. And it'll send you straight to hell. I said, so tell you what, I know that's probably hard. Try not being gay until 11 o'clock when we start services. Just don't be gay overnight. And just start there. Fast from being gay. I'll fast with you. Fast from being gay overnight. And then he just never had heard anybody talk like that. It's like from a completely different worldview, where your sexual identity isn't innate and immutable and the ultimate cause of everything. It's just a behavior like any other behavior, right?
Yes.
So he said, "Well, I can't come to church with you because I couldn't be who I really am." And I said, "Oh, well, now you've really hit the real question. So let's talk about that. You think you're a biological computer that's been programmed to satisfy largely unconscious desires. And I think you're something that deserves much more dignity than that. I think you're an immortal soul. So why don't we have a discussion about anthropology and talk about what a person is? Because that's what we just really disagree here. We don't agree on what a person is. And I just think you're much more important. And the guy started crying.
Wow.
Yeah. So the duel in America, it looks like a political duel. It looks like we're fighting over We're not.
No.
We're fighting actually over the meaning of what it is to be a person.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental philosophical problem between left and right. And so they can talk about freedom and we can talk about freedom, but we don't mean the same thing
Right.
by freedom. They can talk about, democracy. We can talk about democracy. We don't mean the same thing because they have a completely different idea of what a person is. And I will say Christianity is the unique world religion that brought personhood to the fore. And the idea of the dignity of persons is a central part of Christianity. And it's wholly absent in the thinking and philosophy of the left.
Yeah. I mean, I'm telling you, Jeff, I could sit here and talk to you all day, but unfortunately,
All right.
our time has come to an end. I definitely would love to have you back on again.
Sure.
And I think it's you're everything you said is spot on. We've got to figure out a way to put into law protections for our children. And the only way those laws are going to really protect our children is one, they're federal. And if two, they do call into all of these chemicals.
It's got to be child abuse.
It's got to be child abuse. There
It's not child abuse. It's a fake law. I can just tell you right now. It's fake law.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
I know John and I've learned a lot.
Yeah, please keep us posted
Will do.
as to what goes on.
I've got your email address and I'll keep you up to date.
Absolutely. So thank you so much.
I'm visiting my sons in California this weekend. I have supervised visitation. I have less visitation than convicted pedophiles. But I'm visiting my sons this weekend. I'll let you know how it goes.
Well, we'll definitely be praying for you.
Oh, God bless.
And we will be lifting up your son and praying that somehow your wife has a change of heart that can only come about by the Spirit of God. But again, thank you so much, Mr. Younger, and we appreciate it. And folks, that is going to do it for today's episode. And please like, share, and follow us here on Facebook, on YouTube, or on Twitter. And let's make a difference out there. Let's start changing lives, and let's put some laws on the books that actually have power. That's all I've got. I'm Shannon, and that's my partner,
John Cummings.
And we'll see you folks next time.
Adios.